Okay, let's dive right into this. Welcome, everyone, to today's Explainer. If you've ever found yourself totally fascinated by literary history or how great works of art are actually constructed from the ground up, you are in the exact right place. Today, we are cracking open the vault on William Shakespeare. Specifically, we're taking a really close look at his Roman plays, and we're going to uncover a secret weapon that he relied on to build his absolute masterpieces. You know, we naturally tend to picture Shakespeare sitting alone in some dimly lit room just pulling these incredibly complex plots and characters entirely out of thin air, right? It's that classic myth of the solitary genius. But did Shakespeare actually invent his best plots? Well, prepare to have that assumption delightfully challenged. It turns out that three of his absolute greatest plays, Julius Caesar, Antony and Cleopatra, and Coriolanus, were not entirely his own invention. No way. In fact, they are drawn almost line for line from another author entirely. Consider this really famous observation. If you have read any of the lives in this book, you have already read Shakespeare. The book they're talking about here is Plutarch's Parallel Lives. This ancient text was, for all intents and purposes, Shakespeare's architectural blueprint. Now, just to be absolutely clear, the breathtaking poetry, that actual undeniable music of the words on the stage, that is entirely Shakespeare's own genius. But the events, the specific scenes, the underlying moral architecture, those belong entirely to the ancient Greek historian Plutarch. So, let's jump into section 1. Enter Sir Thomas North, the 16th century translation telephone. Now, you might be wondering, how in the world did an ancient Greek manuscript literally make its way onto the desk of a busy playwright in Elizabethan England? It's like a giant puzzle. The linguistic journey starts, of course, in ancient Greece with Plutarch's original manuscript. But Shakespeare wasn't exactly reading Greek. The text first jumped into French in 1559, thanks to a translator named Jacques Amiot. Then, 20 years later, in 1579, an English scholar named Sir Thomas North gets his hands on it. But here's the kicker. North didn't translate from the original Greek. He translated Amiot's French version into English. The results of this massive game of translation telephone was an English text that was incredibly vigorous and just a little bit old-fashioned. It was absolutely perfect for making Plutarch accessible to a literate but maybe not classically trained reader, someone exactly like William Shakespeare. And guys, make no mistake, Shakespeare didn't just casually flip through this book on a rainy afternoon. North's translation of Plutarch became one of the most widely read books in Elizabethan England, and Shakespeare almost certainly owned his very own well-worn copy. He used it constantly. In fact, his debt is just incredibly obvious to anyone who sits down and compares the texts. Long stretches of North's 1579 prose are reproduced almost verbatim as Shakespearean blank verse. He would literally read Norse paragraphs and weave them directly into the rhythm of his plays. It's truly amazing. Okay, let's move on and see how this builds in section 2. The 3 Roman plays, from historical blueprint to theatrical building. First up is Julius Caesar, written in 1599. And honestly, of all the plays, this is the one that follows Plutarch the most closely, drawing heavily from the lives of Caesar and Brutus. I mean, think about the iconic moments. The chilling warning of the soothsayer, that bitter quarrel between Brutus and Cassius, the dramatic Senate scene, the famous funeral oration, and Brutus's final battle and death at Philippi. Every single one of these major incidents, they are completely Plutarch's. Even the core moral arguments, like Brutus's hesitation before joining the conspiracy or his fateful refusal to silence Mark Antony, all of that comes straight from the ancient historian. But we have to remember, Shakespeare was a man of the theater, through and through, and he knew exactly how to thrill a crowd. So while Plutarch provided the solid facts, Shakespeare brought the sheer theatrical punch. He added Calpurnia's terrifying dream. He threw in those supernatural omens raging in the storm. He added the spine-tingling appearance of Caesar's ghost visiting Brutus before the Battle of Philippi. Basically, Shakespeare took that sturdy, moral architecture of Plutarch and just beautifully decorated it with these brilliant, suspenseful micro-narratives. And this perfectly illustrates the partnership between these two writers. Take Antony's funeral oration. Plutarch mentions this speech, sure, but he only gives it a brief passing notice. Shakespeare takes that tiny little seed and expands it into an absolute, sustained masterpiece of political rhetoric, giving us those famous lines, the masterful manipulation of the crowd, expanding a small historical footnote into one of the greatest moments of literary creation in history. That was pure Shakespeare. We see this dynamic pop up again in Antony and Cleopatra, written in 1606. In a lot of ways, this play is an even closer translation than Julius Caesar. There's this remarkably famous scene where the character Enobarbus describes Cleopatra in her barge, saying the barge burned on the water. Well, guess what? That entire stunning description is actually Plutarch's set piece. Shakespeare essentially just took North's English prose and transposed it right into iambic pentameter, making hardly a single alteration of historical fact. Now, what's really interesting about this slide is seeing exactly what Shakespeare brought to the table when the facts were already laid out for him. On one hand, Plutarch gives us a man brought down by his weakness for a woman, a very human historical failing. But Shakespeare, he adds this incredible tragic interiority, a man bringing his entire world down with him. As the source material notes, these two readings are completely compatible, but they are absolutely not identical. Shakespeare is the one who adds that devastating emotional gravity. The third of our Roman plays is Coriolanus from 1608. Once again, the climactic scene where Volumnia kneels before her son at the gates of Rome is translated in a nearly literal sense from Plutarch. I mean, the speeches are direct paraphrases. But Coriolanus is perhaps the most morally complex of the three plays. Unlike the deeply passionate Antony or the highly principled Brutus, Coriolanus has this proud rigidity that makes him, honestly, very hard to admire. Through this specific play, Shakespeare is asking a deeply discomfiting, fundamentally Plutarchian question. What kind of man cannot live in his own city? All right, let's look at section 3, Beyond the Roman World, a broad and lasting influence. So while these three Roman plays are definitely the most obvious examples, Plutarch's influence absolutely did not stop there. His fingerprints are literally everywhere. The character of Theseus in A Midsummer Night's Dream, that's a direct nod to Plutarch. The play Timon of Athens, it draws entirely on a brief notice found in Plutarch's Life of Antony. But perhaps most significantly, the very structural habit of comparing two historical figures across an entire play, like comparing Hamlet to Fortinbras or comparing Henry V to the French king, that whole structural method of comparison is at its root a deeply Plutarchian habit. Which brings us to our final act. Section 4, Facts versus Feelings. The ultimate literary partnership. The famous critic, William Hazlitt, once wrote this beautiful quote, "Shakespeare alone among all writers has left a portrait of human life as full and as various as the world itself." But, we know now exactly where he got the inspiration for that immense variety. Alone among all the books Shakespeare owned, it was Plutarch's parallel lives that handed him this profound sense of the vast, complex variety of human types. So the crucial point here, the big takeaway, is this. Plutarch will tell you what people did. He provides the actions, the historical record, the rigid moral framework. But Shakespeare? He gives you what people felt. He brings the tragic interiority, the soaring poetry, the rhetoric. Even though these two guys lived 18 centuries apart, they are not just source and adapter. They are true partners. Each completely fulfills and completes the other, marrying history with poetry to create a fully multidimensional understanding of human nature. And that brings us to a really important term, synkresis. This is the Plutarchian form, or habit, of comparing two historical figures or subjects to reveal deeper moral or character truths. Remember, Plutarch's book was literally called The Parallel Lives. It was designed from the ground up for comparison. And understanding this concept, it unlocks an absolutely incredible way for you to experience literature. So, I want to leave you with this question. Are you ready to write your own synkresis? If you really want to experience one of the greatest reading journeys in the English language, your next step is pretty clear. Go read Plutarch's chapters on Caesar, Brutus, and Coriolanus, and then read Shakespeare's plays right alongside them. Compare the two. Put Shakespeare's Brutus right next to Plutarch's Brutus. I promise you it is one of the most sophisticated, highly rewarding exercises you can undertake as a learner. You now know the master's secret weapon. The only question left is how will you use it to understand the world just a little bit better? Thanks so much for joining me on this explainer, and hey, happy reading!